Did you know that 67% of Americans report sabotaging their own success when they're on the verge of a breakthrough? The strangest part? Your brain is actually designed to stop you right before success. And today we'll show you why. What Carl Jung and Jordan Peterson discovered about self-sabotage is shocking. There are exactly 4 neurological triggers that activate right before success. And once you recognize them, you can neutralize them completely. By the end of this video, you'll understand the hidden self-sabotage triggers hardwired in your brain, recognize your personal pattern, and have a practical method to override these triggers permanently. The third trigger, which most people never identify, is actually the most powerful, and the easiest to overcome once you know exactly what to look for. Self-sabotage isn't just bad habits or weak willpower. According to Dr. Jordan Peterson, it's your brain's misguided attempt to protect you from perceived danger. In a University of Chicago study, researchers found that 77% of people unconsciously create obstacles to their own success. Stop blaming yourself for a moment. This isn't a character flaw. It's a neurological protection mechanism that once served your ancestors but now limits your potential. Carl Jung, one of history's most influential psychologists, discovered what he called the shadow, the repository of all parts of ourselves we've rejected or never developed. Jung observed that when we're about to achieve something that conflicts with our self-image, these shadow elements actively work to maintain the status quo. Consider the case of Vincent van Gogh, who repeatedly sabotaged his chances at commercial success. Jung would argue that Van Gogh's shadow couldn't reconcile his self-image as a struggling artist with the possibility of recognition. Dr. Jordan Peterson's research on competence hierarchies reveals that our brains are exquisitely attuned to our social position. Peterson explains that moving up any hierarchy triggers both reward and threat responses in your brain. Success literally activates the same brain regions as physical danger. Think about Adele canceling her Las Vegas residency at the last minute, or Michael Phelps discussing his pre-Olympic anxiety attacks. Their brains were signaling danger precisely when success was imminent. So while Jung shows us the psychological roots, Peterson reveals the neurological mechanisms. Together, they help us identify the exact 4 triggers that activate right before success. The first trigger is something you've experienced countless times but probably never recognized as self-sabotage. In fact, it's likely happening to you right now in at least one area of your life. The visibility trigger activates when success would make you more seen, exposed, or subject to judgment. This trigger stems from your brain's amygdala, which processes social threats. As Peterson points out, this is a survival mechanism from our tribal past where standing out could mean exile. Consider J.K. Rowling, who initially published under initials specifically to avoid visibility. Even after Harry Potter's success, she published crime novels under a male pseudonym, a classic visibility avoidance strategy. Common patterns of this trigger include procrastinating on important projects, sabotaging public presentations, and avoiding promotions. Think about it. What accomplishment are you currently delaying that would make you more visible to others? Jung would recommend shadow integration, consciously acknowledging your fear of visibility rather than denying it. Peterson suggests voluntary exposure, deliberately practicing increased visibility in small, manageable steps. The identity trigger fires when success would force you to revise your self-concept, essentially becoming someone new. Jung called this enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposites when pushed to extremes. Your psyche resists fundamental identity changes. Look at Lady Gaga, who has spoken openly about her struggles transitioning from Stefani Germanotta to her famous persona. Or Dave Chappelle walking away from $50 million when success conflicted with his self-image. You say you want success, but are you prepared to become the person who has that success? Peterson's approach involves creating a hierarchical integration of your current and aspirational identities, seeing change as evolution rather than replacement. Before we continue to the third trigger, which is the most insidious of all, honestly assess which of these first 2 triggers resonates most with your experience. Have you ever been right on the verge of a breakthrough, only to feel an unexplainable urge to retreat to familiar territory? That's your brain's self-sabotage system at work. So far we've uncovered 2 massive self-sabotage triggers. The visibility trigger that makes you avoid being seen, and the identity trigger that resists becoming someone new. When Oprah Winfrey was transitioning from local news to national television, she faced both triggers simultaneously. She's described feeling not good enough, and like an imposter, classic symptoms of these first two triggers. Yet by recognizing and naming these fears, she was able to move through them. But the third trigger is where things get really interesting. And it's the one Jordan Peterson has identified as perhaps the most powerful unconscious force in human psychology. The responsibility trigger activates when success would increase your obligations, expectations, or the consequences of failure. As Dr. Peterson explains in his work on the psychology of responsibility, the more potential you actualize, the more responsibility you assume. Your brain inherently recognizes this burden. Consider Elon Musk's public anxiety during Tesla's near bankruptcy, or LeBron James discussing the weight of expectations after joining the Miami Heat. Success exponentially increases responsibility. Imagine achieving everything you're working toward right now. Now notice, does part of you feel anxious about all the responsibility that would bring? Peterson suggests voluntarily picking up the heaviest load you can carry, deliberately accepting responsibility in incremental steps to build your capacity. The authenticity trigger activates when success would require behaviors, environments, or relationships that feel misaligned with your core values. Jung emphasized the importance of what he called individuation, becoming your authentic self. Any success path that diverts from this feels inherently threatening to your psyche. Think of Dave Chappelle walking away from his $50 million Comedy Central contract, later explaining that the work environment was compromising his artistic integrity, a classic authenticity trigger response. Close your eyes for a moment and envision your most desired achievement. Now pay attention. Does any aspect of that vision feel not you? That discomfort is the authenticity trigger. Using Jung's concept of holding the tension of opposites, learn to recognize authentic versus inauthentic components of your goals, modifying your path rather than abandoning it entirely. Let's try something different. Take 10 seconds right now to identify which of these 4 triggers has most affected your progress in the past. Really pause and consider this. Whether you identified one trigger or several, simply naming these mechanisms significantly reduces their power over you. What makes these triggers so powerful is that they rarely operate alone. As Peterson notes, they form an interconnected defense system in your psyche. When Adele canceled her Las Vegas residency hours before opening night, she later admitted feeling both the authenticity trigger, "This show doesn't feel like me," and the responsibility trigger, "I couldn't disappoint people with something that wasn't perfect." Now that we understand these 4 triggers, the question becomes, how do we permanently override this self-sabotage system? The answer lies in a method that combines Jung's shadow integration with Peterson's hierarchical responsibility. And it's something you can begin implementing today. Both Jung and Peterson agree on a fundamental principle. What you make conscious can no longer control you unconsciously. As Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This is the key to overcoming self-sabotage. The integration method works in 3 phases: recognition, dialogue, and strategic action. In phase 1, recognition of patterns, use what Peterson calls precise speech to name exactly which triggers activate in which situations. Create what Jung would call a trigger inventory. Document when and how each of your self-sabotage patterns emerges. When Michael Phelps and his coach Bob Bowman identified his pre-competition anxiety patterns, they created a detailed map of his psychological triggers, which became the foundation of his mental training program. For phase 2, dialogue with sabotaging parts. Use Jung's active imagination technique to dialogue with the parts of yourself that sabotage your progress. Ask your sabotaging impulse, what are you trying to protect me from? What do you fear would happen if I succeeded? Tim Ferriss, author and entrepreneur, publicly discusses using this exact dialogue technique to overcome his fear of expansion and visibility. He literally journals conversations with his self-sabotaging patterns. These sabotaging parts aren't your enemies. They're misguided protectors that need direction, not elimination. In phase 3, strategic integrated action, apply Peterson's incremental exposure method, deliberately triggering each self-sabotage mechanism in controlled, manageable doses. For each trigger, create 3 levels of exposure: minimal challenge, moderate stretch, and significant growth. Will Smith describes in his memoir using exactly this graduated exposure approach to overcome his fear of failure. He began with small acting challenges before attempting major roles. Which self-sabotage trigger will you deliberately activate, at a manageable level, this week? The power of this three-phase approach lies in its systematic nature. Unlike motivational techniques that provide temporary inspiration, this method creates lasting neurological change. By consciously engaging with your self-sabotage triggers rather than avoiding them, you gradually reprogram your brain's response pattern. Consider Olympic gold medalist Michael Phelps, who worked with his coach to identify exactly when and how his anxiety triggers would activate before competitions. Instead of trying to eliminate these triggers, Phelps learned to recognize them as signals that he was pushing important boundaries. This recognition-based approach transformed his relationship with pre-competition anxiety from an obstacle into a performance enhancer. We've uncovered the 4 neurological triggers that cause self-sabotage: visibility, identity, responsibility, and authenticity. Remember, these triggers aren't flaws. They're protective mechanisms that once served you but now limit your potential. Through conscious recognition, honest dialogue, and strategic action, you can transform these triggers from obstacles into signposts on your journey. As Jordan Peterson says, the purpose of life is finding the largest burden that you can bear and bearing it. Self-sabotage triggers don't mean you're broken. They signal you're approaching meaningful growth. As Jung would say, they're invitations to become more whole. Remember Sarah Blakely, founder of Spanx and America's youngest self-made female billionaire. She experienced all 4 triggers, particularly the visibility trigger. She's described feeling physically ill before major public appearances. But by naming and facing these triggers directly, she transformed limitation into extraordinary success. Which of the 4 self-sabotage triggers resonates most with your experience? Share in the comments below. Naming it is the first step to integration. As Carl Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." Your self-sabotage patterns are not your destiny. They're simply signposts pointing toward your next evolution. By applying the integration method shared today, you transform what once stopped you into what now propels you forward. The very triggers that once blocked your success become the guideposts leading you to your greatest achievements. Hey, incredible growth seekers! Wow, what a journey! If this video resonated, subscribe now for more life-changing content. Join our community of self-improvers. Smash that like button to fuel more content on mindfulness, goal setting, and emotional intelligence. Share this video to create a ripple of positive change. Comment below about your growth journey. Your insights shape our content. Next week, boosting self-confidence and overcoming limiting beliefs. Don't miss it. Every interaction brings us closer to a world of empowered individuals. Let's make personal development global. Stay inspired, keep growing. Your best self awaits. Let's unlock it together.